Blessings free. Gotcha! I muttered as I grabbed a pair of eggs out of a henhouse, depositing them into my basket. All around the farm, people were hard at work. In the week since we arrived at the Tollbacker farmstead, much of the abundant harvest had come in, and threshing the parts that had finished drying was well underway. I wasn't part of it, the harvest, threshing, or even the winnowing. But while the family and farmhands were hard at work, along with a couple dozen transient workers, there were lots of little things that still needed doing around the place. For me, that meant simple and basic tasks. Little things. None of the Tollbackers had kids older than 4, so it was just me and one of the farmhands' boys to do all the stuff meant for kids. Collecting eggs from the chickens and collecting berries or fruits in the wilder patches between fields. It was mostly busy work and all very simple, so I was fairly sure we were given the tasks just to keep us out of trouble. But finding the eggs was a harder task than I expected. Some of the hens were sneaky, and there was a time limit before a baby chick started growing inside, which wasn't something I wanted to find in a meal. It'd be gruesome. That's 12 nests, just 2 more. I wasn't really part of the working farm, nor was Celestine when it came down to it. She worked her craft and gave them bumper harvests and protected the farm from blights and pests. But at the same time that meant she was busy with her craft rather than performing more normal tasks around the farm. I only got roped into doing chores because I ended up idle when Celestine was busy and I wasn't helping Mama. Mama was putting a lot of work into expanding the farm's herb garden, putting down seeds and rearranging the plants so they'd grow better. It would be nice in the coming months to have a bit more flavor in our food, but it worried me how much she was putting herself into it. It reminded me of Mum when she got depressed and used an obsession to keep herself going. I didn't want it to happen again. Picking up a squawking hen, I found the last nest and another delicious little egg. Tucking the hen under my arm and out of the way, I grabbed it. "And done!" I proclaimed, letting the hen go free and scampering away. Before heading back inside the farm, I looked out over the workers. Threshing was back-breaking work. Half a dozen men continuously swinging flails at a pile of dried wheat to separate the edible grain from the heads and stalks. They'd still be at it long after the harvest was done, and then even more time would be spent on every good windy day to separate the grain from the chaff. I couldn't help but think of something I'd watched once. An old horse-powered threshing machine. Hardly a combined harvester, but just a series of bells, drums, fans and other stuff that had done the majority of the work with a pair of horses walking in a circle. And so much faster too. It was strange how, despite Galeas having some industrialization, other parts were utterly lacking. While traveling with Mama, we had passed one of the steel mills near the capital, and they had a sodding Bessemer converter, or at least what looked like one, and it certainly poured out an impressive amount of metal. But agriculturally, it was all manual labor, no real mechanization. The incongruity bothers me. Why had Galeas advanced in some fields but not others? With a bit of effort and spending the time to learn how to work wood properly, I could probably build a rudimentary threshing machine, make redundant half the workers that were brought on for the harvest season. Such had led to riots before? I didn't remember too well. There were so many things I knew but were slipping away year by year, only propped up by seeing where they should have been. "Gwen!" I heard Celestine call for me. "Get over here, we're heading to the Albatrons." "Just a minute!" I held up the basket of eggs before dashing inside the house and dropping the eggs down in the kitchen. As I came out, I brushed some stray bits of hay out of my hair. I had ridden a horse before, in this life and in the one before, but it wasn't something I had much experience with, so I was glad when Celestine pulled me up in front of her on Sable, rather than telling me to get Hazel out of the stable. I'd need to learn to ride at some point, probably, but it wasn't just yet. One of the Albaton's horses got a lame leg pulling their cart around. We're off to fix it up. It'll be a good chance to see how I work. I nestled back into her, trying to get comfortable. Not try it myself? Not this time. She took a hand off the reins to pat my head. Too much work to be done to take too long on it, though I'm sure you could manage it given a few hours. Won't be long until the weather breaks. Every bit of daylight counts. A little over an hour's state ride away was the Albertron's farm, one a lot like the Tollbeckers if a bit smaller and with a much less impressive harvest. Still, they had many a worker toiling away at the same work who took a glance at us as we passed. Their attitude and expressions were familiar. A few stopped their work to make warding signs associated with the holy light. Others, those who suspected were part of the farm and not transient workers, watched with the same wariness mixed with pragmatic acceptance I saw so often with Mama when we visited an isolated village. Whether they liked it or not, they wanted Celestine's help. But even for them, those that spotted me didn't have as friendly a gaze for me, and it was easy to guess why. My teacher was a known quantity, her disposition and abilities proven over the years. She lived nearby and had been called. But me? I was just a strange girl, riding along in front of her, a complete unknown. Yet there was one thing that would be clear for any with eyes. If Celestine was bringing me, it meant I was an apprentice in her craft. I could feel them sizing me up as someone to keep a wary eye on, to not be allowed out of sight for a moment, lest I make mischief with my witchery. It wasn't anything new. When I had first noticed those same looks, I had been 5, and I had hidden Mama's skirts, cried, and wondered why. I didn't like feeling their gaze without Mama here. Celestine was nice and a good teacher, but she wasn't my mother. But that didn't mean I would wilt and give in. Good, keep your head up, Celestine whispered quietly. When they called for aid, I chose to come. I chose to bring you. If they find issue with that, then their horse shall stay lame for the harvest. Mama said the same, I whispered back. She had helped me until I cried myself out that day, but afterwards she told me it was just the way of things, that we couldn't change it, that even if they feared us, they still deserved our help, deserved our blessings, praised me every time I stood straight and unbent under the weary gaze of those who needed us. Mama taught me to be proud of what we were, what we did, no matter what others thought. We were the witches of Gilneas, and they were our people, ours to watch over and aid in times of need. One of the men stopped in his work, walked up to us as Celestine brought Sable up just outside the farm buildings. Fair day, mistress, he said, eyes flickering to me only a moment before respectfully staying intent on Celestine. In turn, she let out a short hum before closing her eyes and taking a long breath. When he drifted open again, she spoke. A fair day for now, Albertron. Perhaps 4 hours till the rains begin. He nodded grimly. How much will it be? Celestine shrugged. It will linger through morning. Past that the winds will change. If there's more to come, I cannot say. Albertron turned to his farmhands, who had stopped working to watch us. You heard her! Start finishing up and get the stuff drying under the shelter. That means you, Roger! He yelled, startling one of the young men who was leaning on a fence and chatting with a girl. He turned back to us and tipped his head and doffed his hat. My thanks for the warning, mistress, but Devlin's this way, if you can follow? With practiced ease, Celestine slid off Sable's back, then reached up and plucked me off and put me on the ground next to her. She passed the reins to me and followed after Albertron. I hadn't been told what to do, so I hesitated a moment before I started to follow, Sable trailing behind me as we walked towards the Albertron's barn. Another one? Don't recognize her. Don't look like she's Celestine's girl. Too pretty. Shh! What if she hears you? You're asking to be cursed? The witch's got 2 girls, but they're babies. Unless she used her magic to make one grow fast. I ignored the whispers as I walked. Celestine certainly paid them no heed. They weren't as quiet as they thought they were being. The sad thing was, if they'd kept up their work more intently rather than stopping to stare, I probably wouldn't have heard them. Sable snorted as we entered the barn. The smell of blood in the air. Inside, the source was clear enough. An old grey draft horse was laid out on a bed of straw atop an old cart, breathing heavily and unhappily. Rough bandages covered one of the horse's legs. Took 6 of us to get him in here, Albertron said. Didn't want anyone watching while you worked. Is there anything you need, mistress? "What would you ask for, Gwyneth?" she said, not quite answering his question. I led Sable closer, having to take a moment to pat the mare's nose and reassure her that there was no danger, and crouched down to look at the leg. Out of reach so I couldn't get kicked if Devlin acted up, of course. I wasn't stupid. Freshly boiled water. Healing the wound means nothing if rot sets in. Nothing Celestina taught me indicated she knew how to cure diseases or infections. Mitigate them, reduce symptoms with herbal remedies, but not just magically remove them. Same as every other witch. And if there is any, a dash of alcohol for the same? Celestine hummed approvingly, saying nothing. She merely looked at Albatron, who gazed back. Eventually, after almost a minute of silence, she spoke. "Well, you heard her. Boiling water and a bottle of spirits. What soap you have as well?" "Ah," Albatron floundered, his eyes turning to me as he grimaced. "Right away, mistress." "The spirits are likely excessive," she said after you left. "But boiled water to wash the wound is the right choice. You forgot soap, however." I bowed my head. I thought getting soap into a cut would be bad, but using it to clean around the wound wouldn't be wrong. "What would you have asked for if there was no blood?" If the injury was internal? That is, just the bone and swelling with no bleeding." "A splint, to hold it in after I set it while I was healing it?" "'Cause I'm still slow at healing, I'd want a straight piece of wood. And some rope. Get the bone put right and hold it together while I heal the break," I said confidently. "Good," she replied, smiling. "Of course, once you're faster you won't need the help, but it's good to know how to work around your limitations. If you had suggested it was needed, I wouldn't have been happy." I saw her meant what took me 5 minutes and a few seconds a couple of days ago. It wasn't bad, just a sprained and swollen ankle, but Celestine was a lot faster than me at healing. While we waited for Albatron to return, she soothed the fallen horse, Sable snorting derisively at another receiving her lady's attention, gently putting her into a sleep from which it wouldn't cause us harm while we worked. A trick I needed to learn. A threshing horse was a deadly horse. Afterwards, she unwound the bloody bandages, revealing a bad break of the horse's leg with some of the bone protruding out. I shivered a little at the sight. A lot of my past squeamishness had been killed over the years in this life, but that wasn't nice to look at. But Celestine worked calmly and quickly. The bleeding was slowed and stopped with barely a whisper of power, and as Albatron returned with the water, it became more and more clear how familiar Celestine was with her work. She spoke just enough to get the people to do what she wanted, to keep out of her way, and had no hesitation in using her powers. Within an hour we were done and riding back to the Tollbacker farmstead. Devlin the horse awake and standing on his own again. A little sign at all that she had ever been hurt. Someday, I would be able to do the same. "Try this one on," Mrs. Stilda said, passing me a heavy woolen cloak. "Should be a good length for you." I slipped the cloak around my shoulders, seeing how it hung. It was just long enough to drag along the floor, a couple of inches too long for me. That could be fixed with a few loose stitches to bring up the hem though, and then let loose as I got bigger. "It's very warm," I said, pulling it about my shoulders. "Softer than my old one too." It wasn't perfect, the wool wasn't super soft, but the inside lining was pleasant enough on the skin. Mrs. Tilda, Keel Harbour's main tailor, chuckled lightly. "I'd hope so. It's a solid winter cloak. If it wasn't warm, everyone I sold them to would be hammering at my door come winter." Not long after the harvest had been pulled in, Mama had decided I needed some new things. Not everything, since I was still growing, but a good cloak that'd last me a few years at least. And a single good outfit to show off when the solstice came around. Or longer if I didn't mind it being a little short later. Something to keep me warm in the coming winter. I hadn't thought I needed it. Sure, my old cloak was a lot of sewn patches and extensions, but it was perfectly serviceable. Most of my clothes were like that. It was just something I'd gotten used to. My mama wanted me to have one good set to wear as Celestine's apprentice. What stopped me from fighting with Mama over it, when the money could be better spent elsewhere, was a reminder of the gold we got from Lord Cantron. This might cost a pretty bit of silver, but it wouldn't cost gold. How long will it take to make? Mama asked. If possible, we'd like it done before the full moon. There's a fair few orders running this close to winter, Mrs. Tilda replied, looking me up and down. Can't say I've got anything suitable on hand, so I'll have to make it from scratch. Most folk who can afford dressing their kids up go to the city. Ain't it far if you're willing to pay for the coach? Just Baron Hagen's family and the mayor's kids who've come to me of late. So it'd be a fair investment of time, and I'm quite busy. She was angling for an expedience fee. Even I could see it. It's fine, Mama. Mistress Celestine said she would put me forward at the solstice, not a lunar meeting. Mama just sighed and looked down sadly. I know, but I wanted you to have it sooner. After a few moments, she stood up and brushed herself off. For the solstice, then. Alright. Mrs. Tilda sounded put out rather than happy she had more time to work. Easy enough, they'll be done. I suppose it's something to do after the pre-winter rush dries up. A few coins exchanging hands later and I had a new cloak. In a couple of months I'd have a new outfit suitable for a big meeting with other witches, where Mr. Celestine would introduce me formally as her apprentice in the craft. We declined having Mrs. Tilda take in the ham for us. That was easy enough work and we had plenty of thread for it back home. Home. Funny, the Tollbecker farm actually felt like home. Mr. Celestine made me feel welcome. The farmhands were weary at first, but after they got used to me they were just polite. Robin wasn't sure what to make of me, but that felt more like it was because he was used to deferring to witches and I clearly was one. But I was also a child who should be deferring to him, as the owner of the farm. His brothers didn't make any fuss either. That little cot drawn up in the side space of the main house's hall had become my home. My place to fall asleep in Mama's arms, warm and comfortable and safe. The very thought of it made me smile. It was a heady thing. We passed through the market on our way back, Mama stopping here and there to look over the wares. Kiel Harbor had an even bigger market, even discounting all the fish, than a town its size would normally have, being a major port and all, so there was lots to see. Mama, I piped up, spotting something I wanted. Mama, can I buy something? She turned to look at me, a sweet smile on her face. Of course. What were you thinking of? I pointed at the stall. Parchment, quills and ink. You taught me to read and spell, and I've got ideas. I don't want to forget them, so I want stuff to take notes with. Mama seemed a little disappointed in my answer. I couldn't figure out why, but it was there for a moment before she covered it up with the same sweet smile as before. Of course, what have you been thinking of? Is it to do with your lessons? No. I shook my head. She seemed to relax slightly, which was weird. Just some stuff I thought about. Harvest takes a lot of work and maybe there's a way to make it easier. Her smile became fixed again, the lost tension returning. It'd be wonderful if you could, she said, though it sounded hollow. Why? I wanted to ask what was wrong, but I was scared. I grabbed her hand and smiled up at her, begging in my mind that it could somehow be infectious and cheer her up, and tugged her towards the stall. The silly merchant kept trying to get me to buy a quill based on its prettiness. In the end, getting a less ostentatious quill, an entire notebook worth of parchment, and a pot of reasonable ink cost us 3/4 as much as the cloak had. More silver than I felt happy spending on a whim. But Mama spent it, and spent it without hesitation for me. Somehow I needed to make this worth the price she paid. I'd wanted it because I couldn't remember everything. I remembered lots of stuff about the lore, about the Industrial Revolution, about how I might make things better, but bit by bit it was going. I couldn't remember the name of the lady who was a black dragon in disguise in Stormwind anymore, or what her plan was. I knew a Bronzebeard brother ended up in Northrend, but I couldn't remember why he was there or why it was important, let alone which one he was. Some things, like the Northgate Rebellion, I thought about too much to forget. I didn't know what I would do about that. It was civil war. It would be horrible. But Lord Crowley was right. Isolating the kingdom would be King Greymane's greatest mistake. I wanted to make a difference, not as some superpowered grand hero who saves the day, but I still wanted to do more than just throw starfish back into the sea.